And for a starter, I would just like to basically reiterate today's theme, basically the idea of the diasporic experience of a diaspora and a diasporic experience. And we have seen many films that touch upon this issue today and from very different angles. And sometimes not only the idea of being in a different place. And one thing I might want to quote Shen Xing's work, because her work is called Record of Rights, and I don't know how much it is being referenced to the Li Ji, the Book of Rights reference, because in the Li Ji, one idea is the zhu, and being the idea of like a host and a guest. And I think that film definitely plays a lot with the idea of what is a guest and what is a host and things like that. And so in many of the other films, we also talk about questions such as relocation and also temporal, not only spatial relocations, but also temporal relocations, like Zhu Qian's work and also Enoch's work talk a lot about Tian Chai, like the idea of relocation and things like that. So, so as a start, I'm wondering if you would like to maybe each of you could not necessarily each one of you, but basically whoever wants to participate first, maybe to jump in and maybe talk a little bit about your idea on the questions of, for example, like what is being at home or being a guest, or questions such as spatial and temporal relocations, and what you might try to do with your films that you are showing, that you have shown to us today. Since I've been kind of conversing with Shen Xing, maybe Shen Xing could say first. Oh, yep. Yes.
Can you repeat your question again? Sorry.
And for example, like you did talk about like hosts and guests, yeah. And would you like to comment a little bit on that in reference to your film?
I think in my film that the reason why I included the writing that Confucius was writing about the relationship between host and guest is basically also it's about observant, which means Ni Zhaoxing as a Chinese billionaire coming to London to rebuild a culturally significant and historically significant building for the UK, how much can he observe in terms of its own significance, the architecture's own significance? So whether this person can observe it well also has a reflection on his class and where he comes from, his personal history. So that's kind of my the entry to talk about this host and guest relationship. And then in the personal level, there's me as a Chinese and traveling to Northern Europe and then joining my friends for Christ's sake, Christmas family gathering, and then how I behaved and within that kind of environment. So that was the kind of dynamic that I adapted.
And it doesn't necessarily need to be a question and not first answer situation. But let's say Lucy talks about the idea of like British Chinese experience, and what would be like? Would you have something that you would like to say, like, or in response to Shen Xing? Yeah.
I found that really, really interesting in terms of the fact that, I guess for me personally, being dislocated from both the host country, because I was transracially adopted, and my cultural and ethnic roots, I'd never really thought of it in those terms. But I guess I do see myself, even now, 50 years on, still as not really being a member of this society because of the perceptions from both sides of the fence. So I think it's really interesting that sort of pops up as a theme. And I don't know whether that's because of the ethnicity that we, sort of the general ethnicity that we share, and the way that the West still perceives East Asia. I think that might have a lot to do with it.
And we also, I think Zhu Qiang also has talked about relocation. In this case, it's in Changsha, and which is kind of like you are in your like in the hometown, so to speak. But then you are also making this film in London, so yeah.
I guess, yeah, the Hong Kong sort of, can you hear me?
Is it switched on? Yep.
All right, there we go. Okay. Yeah, I guess the starting point for the film was really because my family was involved in this situation, so I sort of wanted to investigate the whole thing. And also, this house that the viewers can see from my film was directly related to my experiences here in a way that all these compensations that my family received because of the demolition of the house has resulted to be my tuition fee and like living cost of my 3 years education here. So there is this kind of relation. And so in a way, making this film is sort of trying to think through this whole process of my 3 years stays here and what does that mean and how is the house related to that. So it's trying to document this experience and add some of my own reflection to it. So there's that element in there. And also some of the shots was newly added, are shots in London. For example, the bits where I was doing the tracing paper when I was drawing it on top of the original architectural sketch, and those were shotted here. And this kind of image manipulation process in the film as well. So it's about, if I'm not in that location, if I'm not back home, how do I process these images and this location as well? So I guess for me, there's that sort of dialectics.
And how about Enoch? Because you're also dealing with a theme which has something to do with relocation, finding a new home. Within Wan Chai is a very specific district in Hong Kong. So would you have something in response to that?
At first, I didn't plan to make this film. It just happened that I was, during the time I was in that area, Wan Chai, a lot, and going to a lot of artistic workshops or speaking to people living there. And I ended up with a lot of oral stories, and I didn't know how to deal with them. And something was going on there. So I just used it as an excuse to sit down, to write a story, to write a script with not a very strong storyline, just two people. They talk about the oral stories that I've collected. So what they've talked about are directly related to the area. And then it happened at that same time, the district council also wanted to commission a film together with an independent film organization. So I thought, okay, that's an excuse to finish the whole thing. And then I ended up got this commission without knowing anything about filmmaking, the process of filmmaking. But essentially, while through the time of doing all the unconscious research, I was very curious about how individuals live their life under the notion of the grand narrative, because sometimes people subscribe themselves into the grand narratives. Like in the story, they have false memory, and then two of them coming together, and then they talk through the memory and to correct the memory. And so this is, I think, especially in the 21st century, we move around a lot. And like people in Hong Kong, because of the 97 handover, people immigrated and then they came back. So I think it's the nature of our lives right now. So this is what I was trying to understand and trying to question. Do you have to have a style to preserve something, and it's everything worth preserving? Was also something I was trying to understand.
It's also very interesting in the way that, because almost like if you grow up in Hong Kong, pretty much that you would know someone who is in the diaspora. And so in some ways, like Wan Chai almost becomes this location where two people from two different kinds of diasporic experiences, because some people would say that Hong Kong itself represents its own kind of diasporic experience, would come together and then exchange their memories and also preserve their the place is pretty much made up of a lot of these diasporic experiences. So definitely we have yeah, and so the idea is that we definitely have two other films that also talk about this issue in very different lights. And so so Zhou Zhao, like, what do you think about, because your film basically focuses a lot on the linguistic issues.
Yeah.
And you mentioned about like your experience in Singapore as well. Like, would you mind commenting a little bit on that?
Yeah, I mean, then I was very interested in sort of opening up a space of around the idea of translation, and also the kind of space not necessarily occurring on a geographical level, but also on a mental level, I guess, and the kind of reflexive moments when one is being left on one's own and having been trapped between two languages, or rather being an exile of two languages, and the kind of experience that one would have in that kind of situation. So, yeah, so basically I made the film when I decided to go back to China on my own after left it for a long time, and then I collected footage and images of simply the lives of people on the street that I found fascinating. And then when I took a step back and I started reflecting on the experience I had in this, the film was shot in Shanghai, 2010, and that was during the Expo period. And I became fascinated by, it was actually, well, initially I made the film, it was meant to be shown on 3 different screens, and then they have a different kind of approach, but I combined them into a single film. But anyway, the point is, so it was more like I was kind of trying to look at the lives of people in the slum, and then this massively fascinating parks that was being reconstructed in order to prepare for the Expo period. And also I was thinking along the lines of a host and a guest, and I was wondering if I can still find a space for myself. And ultimately, I guess what surprised me the most perhaps is also that when I wrote the, how do you say, the voiceover, the thoughts that came first to my head was actually in English. So surprising enough, so believe it or not, the fragments of thought came in English, and then I thought I translated it into Chinese, and then I decided to collaborate with a friend of mine who speaks authentic English. And then we decided to have a go and play with the idea of authenticity and the idea of language in that sense. So it's more, I would think the film is more to do with temporality and the way in which people, I specifically, and hopefully it applies to other people as well, experience this kind of ambivalent space opened up by translation, or the inability to find a certain definiteness in terms of identity or language. Yeah, so.
Can I just jump in and ask a question, since we're on the point of translation? I'm wondering, in your voiceover, it's interesting that you're talking about this idea of an authentic English, and it's quite obvious that the male voice does represent this, at least what I perceive, like a proper English male voice.
Yes.
But also, wondered, did you do the female Chinese voiceover?
Yes, I did, yeah.
But that's equally, that's like a very like a presenter's or enunciator's voice.
Yeah.
I'm also wondering, the text, when you translate it back into Chinese, it's not, the text itself is actually it's not like a formal Chinese at all.
No.
There's different fragments,
really
and so.
Yeah, it doesn't really make sense. I mean, no, I should finish. I should stop.
No, I'm just wondering whether that's intentional, or what's your intention behind that?
Elaborate a bit more. Sorry, I didn't get it.
Oh, I mean, as in because the Chinese text is not coherent, and it sounds like it's been translated by Google. So I'm wondering, what's your intention behind this kind of choice?
I forgot your first question.
No, it was just one question. Like, what's your intention of having like a bad Chinese translation?
It wasn't bad Chinese translation per se. I mean, if you listen to the English version of it, it's quite a bad English writing as well, I would think. I mean, because when I decided I was writing for the voiceover, I was looking over on my diary, and then I especially picked out fragments of thought that does not conform to the normative way of writing in the sense of like a complete sentences. And I deliberately picked those fragments of thoughts precisely because I was thinking about a lot of the classical Chinese writings that I was starting to become exposed to. And I think one of the key features when it comes to language is that in Chinese writing, or this is my own observation, that the idea of a complete sentence wasn't necessary. I mean, it's good, and sometimes occasionally it happens, and I think it really does manifest itself in terms of classical writing, but it's not a must. It's not. I perceive that as a kind of the most distinct difference in comparison with European languages, in which the grammatical structure delivers a moment of temporality and also meaning in itself, and without grammar it's almost impossible to communicate. So when I wrote the English version of it, I deliberately picked out those moments that kind of it's a little bit out of sync, and there's no sense of time almost that explains the future, the present, and the past. And then, well, also catching up on your point on, you know, the authority of the voice, and precisely because I understand that English text itself would sound ridiculous. So I was kind of basically having fun with a friend. I was like, you should do this for me, please. And then please like read it in your most presentable voice, and let's see how convincing it is. And it was an experiment for both of us. And then, yeah. So I think what I'm also trying to do is perhaps a kind of exploration or experiment with the effect of voice, or on the listening aspect of our experience and encountering with a different person. So I hope that answers your question, even though it's very long. Yeah.
So, Chris, actually, your film basically is a tribute to martial art films, like East Asian martial art films and gangster films. And so, and one thing that came to my mind is that, especially in recent years, that language is not only limited in the East Asian region, but it became kind of like a dominant Hollywood language as well. So in some ways, I guess like a lot of us are very interested in knowing like why you would be interested in that form, like film form, and then like in the course of creating that, like what are some of the things that you might want to bring to your audience?
So as in action cinema, action adventure cinema, in that respect.
Yeah, or East Asian cinema, East Asian martial art films and gangster films. Yeah.
I mean, for me, it's just I was a big fan always of like Johnny To films, action films from Hong Kong, Bruce Lee films,
Right.
and I wanted to replicate that here in the UK. And I originally had the idea a couple of years back, but I didn't know of any East Asian actors, and I wasn't aware that there were many actually around in the UK, which is where I met Aaron, who's actually there in the audience. So I had to call you out. And we just sort of formed together, and we sort of made this short action vignette. And it was just pure for the fun of it, really, just to make something that's entertaining, short, that doesn't actually show any sort of like physical contact. So we did it all with rock, paper, scissors, then we showed it through the thumb war. So it was just trying to have as much fun as possible. Also, that there's not, for me, for British cinema, personally, I don't feel that, I mean, there could be more action adventure short films, and we should sort of explore that avenue. That's why I wanted to sort of move down that route.
Interesting. And do you do your own martial art choreography, action choreography, or?
Yeah, so I mean, I've been doing martial arts like since like 15.
Mm-hmm.
So I've always been a huge fan. So watching Bruce Lee, Jackie Chan, and you know, then there's Yuen Woo-ping action directors like that. and just moving forward with that and just playing around. Also, I do a lot of like Muay Thai now, so a lot of the times it's sort of very structured, so they can almost be used as choreography, which is what you learn. So, yeah.
Well, I would like to ask Iman one question because a very important theme in your piece is definitely about family, and so do you have any particular? Is it your own family or is it?
Yes, I went back home during the Spring Festival because my granddad has been ill for about 5 years, and during the stay, I went to stay with my grandparents and also my father because my parents got divorced when I was 12, and so I have very different ideas about family, and I also saw the transformation of my family during this year, and I think it's partly because of the capitalization in recent China. So I see these differences and these changes, and I want to document it as I don't know as part of my experience. Yeah.
Oh,
I'll jump in again because two of the filmmakers sit next to me both chose to use installation as the format. I'm just wondering, why do you make that decision to, have 4 screens, or in this case 3 screens display of your video film?
Actually, my piece is video installation, and I convert it into a single screen work because I think it's a way to see the contrast between young and death, the death of my granddad, and also the energetic power of in my younger sisters.
Yeah, why 3 screens? I guess, like I said before, initially my motivation for making the work was more about an investigation into the mental space opened up by being an exile from both languages, and that space opened up precisely by through an understanding the translation itself is impossible. And it is that internal introspective moment that I was actually really trying to capture and represent in my work and sort of replicate in the film. Not so much. I mean, I wouldn't go so far as to say I'm representing reality as it is in Shanghai Expo period or stuff like that, but for me it's more introspective. So the initial idea, well, it was made into, it was first shown, when it was first shown, it was intended to be shown on 3 separate screens. And then I played a lot with the idea of the blackouts and like awkward and abrupt pauses in between in order to replicate or to construct a kind of temporality, I would think. So for me, that 3-screen idea, which wasn't clear in the fact that I've made them into one, is this kind of repetition, is this sense of rhythm, I think, that I was trying to go for. And yeah.
So basically, Pema is here, and one thing that came to my mind is also the fact that as a Tibetan director working in Beijing, there is also another sense of diasporic experience, being in another place, working in a different environment. So I'm wondering if Pema would like to comment on it, if not. And would you have any questions to any of these filmmakers after you've watched all these films?
因为自己就是因为我自己也是从学电影开始，然后也是从拍短片开始进入电影这个圈子的嘛，所以 对这些短片也有一些就是比如说很熟悉的那种感觉吧。比如说第一个短片，我觉得他对这个家庭的那种氛围，虽然是一个很短的篇幅，但是他用一种很特殊的形式，就是增加了它的容量，然后你可以通过这样一个短片能看到人生的很多状态，比如说这个生老病死，生活的一些常态，你可以在一个画面里面，你可以同时感受到。我觉得这个特别对，很特别。
Because Pamela actually he started filmmaking as a film student when he went to Beijing Academy of Arts, Beijing Academy of Films, and then so when he watched all these short films, he finds it actually very familiar. He's been making that himself, so so he finds it very interesting. And then also like the first film from a story about family. And using 4 screens, 4 channels to show various messages in the family, he found that it's a very unique and a very inclusive method of showing family life and showing so many different things in life. You can see not just this family, but see any humans or any people's like there's so many life and death and illness. You can see a lot of information in one screen, so we think that is very unique.
然后就是那个第二个短片，虽然很短，但是在快结束的时候，晶晶给我翻译了一句吧，就是说，在那个奥运会的时候，他不知道应该支持这个英国还是支持中国，就是有一个这样一个身份认同的这样一个问题。这种事情可能我自己也会经常面临到。所以我觉得这个可能是一个比较长的纪录片吧。刚刚听那个导演讲，这只是一个片花，我就想问一下，这是一个什么样的纪录片？然后会有一个什么样的长度或者结果？
And the second film where it's a trailer of so many interviews of overseas Chinese origins. And then and it's very interesting because in the last part I did translate some of the what they say, that like when one of them like have the question during the Olympic Games whether she should hail for the Tom Daley, the British athletes, or should she hail for the Chinese? So that's an issue that he faces a lot as well. So he's quite curious what kind of documentary it is, how long it's going to be, and how this ends in the end.
The documentary's actually changed quite a lot since I started. Originally it was going to be solely about the 106 Hong Kong adoptees, of which I am one. What happened to us, but I couldn't get enough of the adoptees to actually speak to me on camera, and then I lost the producer that I originally had, and it was a question of, if I want to make it, then I have to do it myself, and it sort of became, I guess it's becoming more like a sculpture, in that we ended up filming over 12 and a half hours of footage so far, and the first sort of kind of like rough draft I cut was 4 hours, and I'm still in the process obviously of editing, and as I've gone through that process it's becoming more and more about the position that I have, the relationship I have with this country that I call my home because I live here, but also how that then positions me as an East Asian, as a Hong Kong Chinese person, and how other people see me through that lens. And I guess the disconnect that I have with those views, and also speaking to other transracial adoptees and other East Asians who do they consider themselves British or Chinese? Do they consider themselves Hong Kong Chinese or British Hong Kong Chinese? What does this actually mean in Britain? And where do we find ourselves? And that's how it starts. That's how it's developing. How it ends, I'm not quite sure. I've still got a lot of footage left to go through.
我觉得这个可能做下去的话，会很有趣吧。因为我自己去年在青海有一个那个青海湖国际诗歌节，他们让我拍一个纪录片，一个官方的纪录片，但同时我自己想拍一个就是就比较独立的纪录片吧，就是因为它会邀请到很多全世界的不同国家的这个诗人来参加这个诗歌节，有很多很多的诗人，所以我想采访就是108个诗人，可能跟这个想法有点接近，108个诗人，让他们谈这个对诗歌的认识，就一个问题，就问他们什么是诗。就我采访的，就是去年采访的这些人，这些诗人，他们对诗歌的理解，就是因为不同国家或者不同背景、不同文化背景，他们对诗歌的理解或者对诗歌的这种。没有，就是我准备采访108个人，然后去年有40多个诗人参加这个诗歌节，然后我就提问他们相同的问题，就是什么是诗？你认为什么是诗？这个中国的诗人跟那个外国的诗人，他们对这个诗歌的理解不一样。然后我觉得这个挺有趣的，就是说，可能这个题材就是这个纪录片，如果做下去的话，会很有意思吧。
Can you hear me? So like this. Basically, Pember thinks your subject is very interesting. He thinks if you finish that, it's going to be a really great film, because he's actually doing something similar himself. So he was asked to shoot a more or less official documentary for an international poet festival in Qinghai. That's where Pember comes from, in the northwest of China. And he was planning, like you, planning to interview a lot of people, 108 poets. But he was only able to interview over 40 of them. And also, he just asked them one single question: what do you think is poetry? So the question and the answer he gets from people from different background, different nationality are very different. So he thinks that's actually, in a way, similar to the film you are making. And he's interested in that kind of approach and in that kind of method. Making film, making a documentary. I've actually been chasing him for that documentary.
So I'm sure actually members of the audience would love to jump in. So would you have questions, comments?
Do you have anyone giving the microphone?
Yes, we do.
Can I just jump in and ask a question again? I feel very wordy today, but I'm gonna take the advice of don't hold back and 不要手下留情 and throw a question to Shen Xing. I really like the film, and I had the privilege of watching it for a few times. So it also made me think of after like 3 times I feel that there's something I don't know there's some observations of mine basically. I think the montage between the images are very ambitious. I'm really impressed by your use of all these different sources, and somehow they all correlate with each other, either through content or through context. I find that quite fascinating. But I think I have a question for the text that you're writing, especially towards the end, when a thesis, like a statement, is emerging, and that's when I feel. That's when I start to feel a bit hesitating almost, because I just maybe wonder whether you can clarify, the argument or the messages at the end, because at moments I feel it's not, if not, I don't know, I get a feeling like maybe there's bits that are not that coherent, or I don't know, maybe I just want to hear more of what you want to say about that.
Which part of it do you think is a statement making?
It's more at the end when you're saying the May of these different years, and you're saying Beijing and Paris, when these sort of comparisons start to appear. I don't know. I just got maybe just want you to talk more about that actually.
Yeah, I think the reason why I included the very significant timing in those 4 years basically have to do with Crystal Palace being the monument of Industrial Revolution, and Industrial Revolution as the revolution that did not lead to an end of a class and only normalized the mobility of economic and labor throughout the globe. And that's why the other revolutions, especially to students like me, are much more significant and personal. For example, 1989. So for me, that's a contrast, and that's also an alienation that certain group of people is able to feel empathetic towards and certain group of people not. So for me, that was not a statement making, that was just as layered as the dinner table.
Also, following on that note, I think the personal bits is also quite interesting, the way you connect the different personal stories to the rest of the story. But I felt, yeah, the dinner table situation. It's when you're reading the text from Li Ji, from the Book of Rites, and that very emotive traditional Chinese music came in. I wondered how is the personal. I don't know. Not a criticism, but just a comment. I got a feeling that the personal story is not as connected as to the other story as I wanted to see in a way. I don't know.
There's no personal story in there, basically.
But like the experiences of you being on the table, right? And that I don't know. I don't want to say it's a bit forced or anything, but
it is
but
forced,
it's just,
I think.
But it's just
yeah.
there's like a small distance there.
I just want to say, like, in my opinion, I think what's most successful for Shen Xing's film, I mean, in terms of her film, for me, is precisely that personal and anecdotal aspect of it. And it's almost like extremely self-reflexive. And in a sense, it's not as if it's there's no pretense to be making a kind of a universal statement, as if this is what a host and guest situation is like. And I think I appreciate that moment of grounding your sort of argument, even though it's nothing like an argument, and then following it up with, it's almost a bit like a of course it's not free association, but I like the layered and also a personal aspect of it. So so it maybe is a different interpretation. Yeah.
Any responses from our audience members?
I think it's more like a comment than question for Shen Xing. For me, I know Yuan Mingyuan's destruction and also the Crystal Palace, but it's like this destruction and reconstruction and the guests and hosts, this shift in between, and it's kind of interplay, which makes it more complicated and also problematic. And if you put it back into the historic context, it's very funny that how during the late Qing dynasty, this kind of invasion was described as the guests want to plunder the host house without permission, and now Chinese tourists and also these investors are warmly welcomed by the UK to build up their own country. So, yeah. And also the soundtrack is very interesting also, because I noticed one soundtrack is like very erratic Chinese opera with these Western instruments, and
did you make it by yourself, and why you chose this kind of?
To answer your first question, not really a question, but just to respond to that, to put that back to a historical context, basically, during that documentary footage that I used from when the English general was given orders to set fire to Summer Palace, and also the comparison of what's happening right now is, for me, is because everything is so economically dominated, and as a personal, as an individual, it's very difficult to claim a position in there to say yes or no to this kind of development. And that's why, and also economic, these developers, they're using artistic language to convince us, saying like this Crystal Palace is going to be used for galleries, restaurants, theaters. So it's also the change and the contingency in economics that is becoming artistic, becoming virtuosic. That's what I was interested in. And the music, it's by Xiaohe, and the part where I used voiced over for the documentary. I mean, he was born in a time that I think during Cultural Revolution. So I think his music is very much influenced by what he's witnessed. And I'm really interested in cross-generation understanding of music. And I use it in my film and in my other works as well. So that's why I chose it, because the composer and their music inherited an ideology that is historical and personal as well.
Well, given your shared concern with the theme of the diasporic experience, I'm wondering how tight or how close the connection of the community of the local Chinese diasporic filmmakers is. So, did you guys know each other before this event? Or do you feel you're influenced by each other? Or do you ever work together as a group or as a new wave?
I can answer that. Because I sort of co-organized the whole thing. So, well, it was an attempt to really, on my side, to try to find more people are making films or making videos, maybe in the loose Chinese speaking context, let's put it that way. But it has been a struggle, really. It has been a struggle to discover more people or find out more people doing it. So I think I know probably half of the panel. It's not like a friends gathering session, not exactly like that, but it's also, yeah, it's just at certain moments during this process of like making open calls or trying to put advertisement, I wish there's more people responding to it. But I think at the end of the day, we did had a good program, and 7 filmmakers all have we presented like a range of different practices, so that's probably good. But I don't necessarily think there need to be or should be a wave of certain sorts of like forces that just because their some similarity has been shared, no matter whether it's ethnicity or subject matter or median of practices. I don't know whether that's necessary, but that's my count.
And just in response to the question about whether, like, how connected our practices are, maybe even if our works don't necessarily look very similar, but actually we do, some of us especially have the privilege of actually continuously conversing about various topics that's been discussed in this in our works. And yeah, it's quite fascinating also to see how people's work and practice develop over time. So I wouldn't say this is like a community sort of strict sense, but community perhaps in a sense that you're involved with each other's practice and learning in the loosest sense possible. I have a question for Zhu Qiang. In retrospect, I think I've got a few questions to ask, but they're actually really good comments. Because that I've been thinking about, but perhaps have not been able to verbalize them properly previously. But having seen them a couple of times, yeah. So I think the first, with regards to your film, I think what's most striking for me is perhaps the humor, especially towards the end when you were negotiating with this person that you were trying to take a photographs with. And also I noticed that throughout the entire film, it seems to me that it's almost like was it a deliberate choice to actually not show any of the actual people involved in the house demolition project at all, and the most kind of the closest sense to reality, as you would call it, is perhaps is the voice of them and the translation that we get to see in that. So I was wondering if you could, and I think I remember, you mentioned something about it's this idea of the camera as something that reveals and the camera as something that almost exhibits. And I wonder if that has to do with your aesthetic choice of deliberately averting the camera away from the individual and always facing this desolate window or like a crack almost that shows nothing but really very minute movement. So, but anyhow, I think it's a great aesthetic choice, but I just thought I'll hear your thoughts on it.
Yeah, you got it right. It is a deliberate choice. I think it's something, of course I would have those footages of the actual interviews and interviewees, but throughout editing and looking at other films that are dealing with this similar subject matter, I start to question myself, is it necessary to show, the evictees? Is it necessary to show, maybe some people will say, the struggles or the activism or that, and also, one of the interview was precisely about this idea of whether they wanted to be shown or not. When I was asking permission, I got rejected. So there is this idea of visibility when it comes to like this kind of urban property activism. Some people want to reveal it. Some people want it to get broadcasted or disseminated around social medias. The other people, to protect for their own well-being or for other certain reasons, they wanted to conceal it. They wanted to hold back and not let them. So I sort of decided to go with the letter and divert the intention maybe back to the conversation and interaction themselves. So the window frames I chose to replace all these actual interviews are taken from the house, which is that family property that yet to be demolished. So in the beginning, you will see this opening shot, which is like 8 windows, and all these shots throughout the films are me putting a camera and shooting outside the windows. So it's also trying to provide like a different way for people to contemplate what is really going on what is going on the demolition site, and what could they see and what could they feel. In relation to a displaced interviews. So that was sort of the idea.
So we probably have time for just one last brief question, and please.
Hi, I guess it's a question for Pema and maybe like all the other filmmakers as well. So I think you just mentioned like you want to make a film about poetry, or like how the international poet actually think about their life. I think that's a quite generic theme, and then like all people will like it. So basically, do you want to make film more objective or more subjective?
虽然我的几部影片都是以一种比较客观的方式呈现，但是我觉得每一部影片里面都有一些主观的呈现吧。
Although the Pema's film appears to be very objective in the way it is presented, but he believes in every film he does have his subjective point of view.
然后就像这一部就正在拍摄的这个诗人的纪录片一样，我觉得以后我的影片可能更多的还是以客观的方式呈现。
Like the documentary he's trying to make about poetry, he still tend to make a more objective, observational kind of films.
因为在目前的这个审查的这样一个状况之下，可能我觉得是以一种客观的方式呈现，就是藏区的一个状况，可能是更现实的吧。
because of the Chinese system of censorship, to just very objectively give the facts and what things are in the Tibetan area, it's a more realistic approach.
Okay, so